we're a free speech organisation, but what we also want is remedy for people who are abused by newspapers. So, for example, one of the things that the press claim they offer but they don't properly is a right of reply. Now, if someone's attacked unfairly, they should have a right of reply. That's delivering them their free speech. Most of the people involved in Hacked Off are strong supporters of the Human Rights Act, which has a fundamental guarantee for freedom of speech in Article 10, a piece of legislation, the Human Rights Act, that is opposed by most of the press who claim they're in favour of free speech. You cannot be in favour of free speech if it just means free speech for your proprietor at the expense of someone else's rights. And it's wholly hypocritical for people like newspaper editors to accuse people who just want a remedy for the innocent people who are affected, and indeed support public interest journalism, to say that we're somehow hostile to free speech. We're supported by investigative journalists like Nick Davis and John Pilger, many of the patrons of Index on Censorship and the organisation Article 19 support the sorts of things that we're calling for. And a huge number of authors and writers have signed the declaration backing the Leveson Royal Charter. So it's just an empty allegation to suggest that anyone who wants to have effective, accountable press regulation is against free speech. It's not only simplistic, it's wrong. I think most people would recognise, or should recognise if they're honest, that the Human Rights Act, which simply delivers European Convention of Human Rights Act accessible through the British courts, is an extremely important piece of legislation to protect human rights, to protect the weak against the strong usually. And of course, the press will attack it for populist reasons when they see it being used by people who they don't like. But the test of effective human rights protection is not only being granted to people you like, but protection from torture, for example, needs to be given to people that you don't like. And it's highly hypocritical of newspapers in particular to attack the Human Rights Act while at the same time claiming their own rights or seeking to claim rights under it. They have to choose one or the other. And I think it's wrong for political parties to pander to this, because the last thing we would want, I think, as a country, would be a disaster for our international standing, is if we were to withdraw in some way from the European Convention on Human Rights, which some countries with much worse records in human rights terms are still signed up to. What example does that set people who we would want to show the way to in human rights terms? The convention was something drafted by British lawyers after the Second World War to try and prevent a repeat of some of the things, including the scapegoating of foreigners that we now see happening all over again in Europe. And it's critical that we remain part of the convention and that the Human Rights Act remains embedded in our law. Clearly, there are a number of well-known people, some people call them celebrities, who support Hacked Off because they've had a bad time of it, but they're not our primary focus. Nevertheless, their families are entitled to privacy. It's not right that they should be the subject of illegal voicemail hacking or surveillance. And they gave evidence at Leveson, and they have people employed that they can afford to use to seek to protect their privacy. And when you ask the public, people do think it shouldn't be open season on someone just because they're successful. Steve Coogan's a good example. He's never sought publicity, he's never claimed to be a moral exemplar to the public, so his private life he's entitled to keep private. There are some types of people in the public eye who court publicity for its own sake, and I don't think we're associated with any of them because they have no complaint, because often they're staged appearances, that's not intrusion. But most of our work and the purpose of the Leveson recommendations, as it says in the inquiry, and the reason that Parliament overwhelmingly backed the Leveson report and the public overwhelmingly supports it, is to protect ordinary people like Christopher Jeffries, who was the retired teacher serially libelled, accused of being a murderer in Joanna Yates's in the Joanna Yates case in Bristol. People like the Dowler family, who were victims of crime, or their daughter was a victim of crime, and people like that. And they're voiceless if it isn't for organisations like ourselves to put their case, because the newspapers hold the megaphone and they just scream their propaganda all the time. And that had no effect on the judge, rightly so. Even Parliament, unusually, was prepared to stand up to the press, and we're continuing to fight to ensure that that remains the case.